Good morning, guys. Today we're going to be reading Chapter 8 of The Case of the Stolen Sculpture, and we're getting really close to finding out who really might have stolen the sculpture, and it's your job to make your final prediction today. So I know that we've had a couple of suspects in mind. We've been gathering some clues, but today you're going to make your last and final prediction before we find out who really did it and what really happened. So this is Chapter 8. Chapter 8 is New Evidence. Mr. Saunders, Amal said as the three friends approached him slowly. Clementine had explained the trap Ruthie had set before they went over there. She didn't want her friends wondering why the poor man was rubbing his butt. "Oh, hi there," Mr. Saunders said, bending over. He pinched the tips of the tacks, collecting them in the palm of his hand. He studied them carefully. "Dangerous litter, isn't it?" "Yes, sir," said Clementine. "Did you kids have some questions about the gallery?" he asked. "No, Mr. Saunders," Clementine replied. "We wanted to ask you something about your shift yesterday." "Yesterday?" he said, lowering his chin and looking down his nose. "When the Gudea was stolen," Raining added. "I see," Mr. Saunders said. He sat down, remembering to check that the bench was clear of tacks. "You're a gang of sleuths, huh?" "Something like that," Amal said. "The statue of Gudea is one of my favorite pieces in the museum's collection," Clementine said. "I just really want to get it back." "Well, that makes two of us, then," Mr. Saunders said. "Everyone else has gone nutty over Mr. Carbone's new wing. The money's rolling in, they say." "Yeah, we heard that too," Raining said. "What is it you want to know?" Mr. Saunders asked. Clementine told Mr. Saunders about the woman in the tea room with the large package and her story about buying it in the gift shop that morning. "Do you remember her?" Clementine asked. "You were working there yesterday, right?" "I was," Mr. Saunders said, "but my shift didn't begin until a little after 10. I missed my bus and decided to walk. Figure as a volunteer that what can they do if I'm late? Fire me? And I don't recall selling anything that large to any woman during the time I was there." "So who ran the shop when the museum opened at 9? Amal asked, crossing her arms over her chest. "Someone had to be there." "Mr. Carbony," said Mr. Saunders. "He was behind the register when I showed up. And let me tell you, he looked none too pleased with me." "Thanks, Mr. Saunders," Clementine said. "You've been a big help." The three friends turned to leave the exhibit. "Interesting how all roads seem to lead back to Mr. Carbony, isn't it?" Amal said as they walked. "Sure is," Raining agreed. Clementine, Amal, and Raining ran into Wilson on the stairs back down to the lobby. "Oh, good, I found you," Wilson said. "Just in time. Come down to the security office. Mr. Preston from Global Property Insurance is here." Moments later, the four friends stood around Mr. Preston in the security office. The four friends looked at Judy. Mr. Preston looked at Judy. "Sure," said Judy. "Sounds about right to me." "Okay," said Mr. Preston, still sounding not quite sure. Clementine wondered what kind of investigator would so readily believe four kids. But if you represent Mr. Carbony, then you already know that he asked our office to move quickly so the museum could get the funds as soon as possible. "So you moved quickly?" Clementine asked. Mr. Preston shrugged. "Well, yes," he said. "As far as I'm concerned, the piece is gone. If the police find it, well then, the museum will have to return the payment. But these art thefts can take years to solve. These pieces often only resurface at a black market auction, usually overseas." "Thank you, Mr. Preston," Wilson said. He put out his hand and the man shook it, still looking very confused. "You've been very helpful. Judy will show you the way out." Judy laughed and took Mr. Preston's elbow as he stood up. "This way, sir," she said, leaving the four friends alone in the security room. "This is pretty complicated," Wilson said, dropping into the big empty security chair. He pointed at the monitor in front of him. "There goes Mr. Preston. He offered a very lacking investigation because—" Wilson pointed at the monitor that showed Mr. Carbony's office. "Mr. Carbony asked him to." "Then they were in it together," Amal asked. Clementine gasped. "You think Mr. Carbony stole the Gudea?" she said. "But what about the woman in the tea room, or in the tea shop?" Raining said. "It was obviously her." Wilson shook his head. "I don't think it was," he said. "I think she really did buy a gift and decided she wanted some tea afterward." "And a fritter," Clementine added. "Can't say I blame her." "So what do we do?" Amal said. "We don't have any proof." "We go to Mr. Carbony's office," Wilson said, leaning close to the monitor, "and we get some." So here's where you're going to make your final prediction. It says, in the next chapter, in chapter 9, tomorrow, you will get to see what really happened to the Gudea. So in the space below, write your final prediction. So you're going to write who stole the statue. It could be more than one person if you think two people worked on it together. talk about why they took it, and then how you think they took it. Okay, and that's your job for Reader's Workshop today. For writing, you are going to think of, I thought this was a fun one. So it says, guess who's coming to dinner? So it says, we've been isolated at home and not able to gather with our loved ones. So close your eyes and think, who would you invite to dinner tonight if you were able to host anyone? So there's also an option for you to draw a table and write the names around it. We won't really be able to do that part on here unless you wanted to do it and then add a picture somehow. But you don't really have to do that part. But I do want you to make sure that you answer these questions. What would you talk about? What would you serve? And then it says draw and label. I'm going to stick with this one. Write the story of how this would go. So it could be a famous person, somebody in our class that you miss. It could be a relative that lives far away, a neighbor, anybody that you would want to come to dinner, and then write about it. In my example, you'll see who I was hoping to invite. I won't spoil it unless in case you want to read it. But again, always use my example. Notice how I indented. Notice how many sentences I have and how I talked about who I would invite. And then sometimes I would forget what I was supposed to add. So I would just click back here and just say, see what it says. What would we talk about? What would I serve? Okay, so that I would go back and add those things in. Okay, so those are your tasks for today. Can't wait to see you. Remember that tomorrow somebody is getting some pizza. So today's your last chance to really, really impress us for that. And then again for the rest of the week for Evergreen Scholar.